Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. This week, by going through the preface to the Bible I use most often, I'm lifting up for you how important it is for each of us to read the preface or introduction in the Bibles we use. There's a lot of important information in them that helps to guide us in our reading and to understand what we are reading. In turn, that helps us to understand the meaning of what we are reading. On Tuesday, I highlighted the question asked by the preface to my Bible: is the Bible one book or many? We are continuing to work toward an answer. Yesterday, we talked about some issues concerning how the Old Testament had been put together, bringing things from many sources into larger works, and then how these works were put together too. The New Testament has a similar story. The first part of the New Testament to be written were the letters of Paul. Paul went on several missionary journeys and founded churches all over what is now Cyprus, Turkey, and Greece. Once he had a church in a city on good footing, then he went off somewhere else to spread the news of Jesus in a different city and to create another church. Then, back at the earlier one, some problem would arise, and Paul would then write a letter back to try to get them on the right track again. Many times the issue was what Paul called Judaizers, people telling these Christians of Gentile heritage that they had to become Jewish first in order to be a full Christian. Paul was adamantly opposed to the idea, affirming that all are welcome in God's grace. In that day, it was common for people to write something and to say that it was written by someone more prestigious than they were in order to get their work read by more people. And so it is that scholars believe that some of the letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul were in fact written by someone else. Just like in the Old Testament, they can tell by writing style, vocabulary, and ideas expressed. These writings are still Scripture, but they most likely weren't written by Paul. Things get complicated when we get to the Gospels. First, we need to speak just a bit about what a gospel is. We tend to think of the Gospels as biographies of Jesus, and in one way they are, but they are also much more. Perhaps a better description would be that they are theologized biographies. In other words, each one tells stories about Jesus, but each gospel writer chose which stories to include in order to make a theological point. Mark, for example, has been described as a passion story with an extended introduction. Mark really emphasized the crucifixion. Many believe that Matthew wrote to a Christian community with a prior Jewish heritage, and he presents Jesus almost as a new Moses, offering God's new way of life. Matthew often seeks to show how the words of the prophets and Psalms point to Jesus, lifting up scriptures his readers would have known and loved. Luke wrote both the Gospel and Acts, and seems to tell the story of God's work of salvation, moving from small backwoods Bethlehem all the way to the center of worldly power in Rome. John tells of 7 signs that Jesus did to show that he was indeed the Messiah. Other than the resurrection, only one miracle of Jesus is recorded in all 4 Gospels: the multiplication of loaves and fishes, or as some call it, the feeding of the 5,000. Other Gospels share some stories and omit others, and some Gospels have stories of Jesus that are unique to them. 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic Gospels. They see things alike. As scholars have worked with this, they have come to believe in the two-source hypothesis. Almost everyone agrees that Mark was the first Gospel written. Both Matthew and Luke have the order of events and passages that are just about word for word identical with Mark, and just about all of Mark is included in their Gospels. So scholars believe that both Matthew and Luke had Mark as a source of material for their Gospels. But there are some stories that Matthew and Luke share that aren't in Mark, And so scholars believe there is another source of material lost to history that Matthew and Luke shared but Mark didn't have. This source is called Q for the German word Quelle, which simply means source. Then, both Matthew and Luke have unique material about Jesus that isn't shared by anyone else. The Gospel of John seems to have come from a different viewpoint and tradition completely. So what we find in the end is that the New Testament is like the Old Testament, drawing together information and stories from various sources and putting them together to best tell God's story. So with all these sources of material making up both the Old and New Testament, we are back to the question we asked on Tuesday. Is the Bible one book or many? Finally, tomorrow, we may have an answer. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.